So, okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think we should make a start. My name is Charles Abukri, Executive Director of Ideas. I am based in Accra. So seems like today I am involved in two very similar topics. In the morning, the students' workshop, we discussed the African development experience. That's a much broader topic. There's a long, depending on how you approach it in time. I think we have a complementary topic this afternoon, contemporary development experiences in Africa. This is an exciting topic, and we have three exciting speakers. The continent at the moment is going through lots of pain, but also with exciting opportunities. It is the same continent that is still tackling some chronic conflicts, very debt crisis, devastating climate crisis, including desertification and so on. It's the same continent that also has produced a South African legal team bold enough to take Israel to the International Court of Justice. The same continent has recently also produced the Niger junta and a couple of other Sahelian countries that have had the courage to take the French imperialism on in several ways. So it's a very continent with very varied experiences, very various challenges, but also various opportunities. We're looking forward to a discussion of these challenges, and hopefully, in addition to identifying challenges, the speakers might also point to how we address them. So the first person to take us forward is Walter. Walter, you have half an hour. You have more than half an hour. We have only 2 hours.
Yeah, you've been super generous.
I'm very generous.
Super generous.
Oh, I thought I was rather mean. That you was protesting. All right. Okay. Yeah, okay.
No, thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, colleagues. So this afternoon, I see just a continuation of the discussion we began on Monday when we had a session on contemporary development challenges in the Global South. And we had some interventions from Georgie focusing on the continent. So I'll pick up on some of the issues and reinforce some of the points, but I believe there is substantial inputs have already been made. Yeah. So if you look at the continent, it's almost 6 decades post decolonization since Africa attained independence from the colonial European colonial masters. But the transition is yet to visit the trajectory of development in the continent. In fact, what we see is moribund industries across many parts of the continent. The industrialization is underway in most parts. So ordinarily, land and land-based social reproduction still remains key. The majority of the population still reside and survive on the basis of land-based social reproduction. Just to give an indication, a recent FAO report based on data in 22 countries showed that 52% of the population in those countries primarily specialize on on-farm activities compared to 21%, the average in other regions. So it reinforces the importance of agrarian-based livelihoods. That being said, the failure of Africa to encounter an agrarian transition is mostly attributed to technological backwardness, based its inability to increase their productivity. But to a large extent, deficiencies have also been added that we don't have there are arms and land markets which can promote the efficient transfer of land to efficient users and so forth. So land remains mostly in the hands of people who are unable to utilize it. Yeah, but the discussion really focuses on access to land, how inequalities in land access contribute to the stalled transition that we still face in the continent, or the unequal trade relations between the continent, which has been integrated into the world economy since the colonial period. Also the absence of agrarian policy interventions, such as those found in the north, is heavy subsidization of agriculture. Those tend to be neglected within the discussion of how we view why Africa is stuck in making a jump towards an industrial path. So today I want to emphasize some of the key land problems that I see growing from the broad range of research, growing from broad range of corpus from the work of Moyo and others, some of the key which have been evolving. A couple of decades ago, there was a big debate on whether land inequalities were only limited to Southern Africa, with proponents and the antagonists in that debate, Moyo and Mafeji emphasizing that outside of these former settler zones, there's no land question. Moyo, on the other hand, emphasizing that even in non-settler regions, we are also increasingly encountering the growing scarcity of land and inequalities, even in places where there was no expropriation of land during the colonial period. Yeah, many African countries have transitioned from being net food exporters in the 70s, and today most of the countries are dependent on food imports. If you look at the Southern African region, it ranges from 30 up to 80% of food imports. If Botswana, Zimbabwe fluctuates between 30 to 60%, depending on the climatic conditions. Yeah, structural adjustment, which was imposed in the 90s, forced a shift of the food policy from self-sufficiency towards food security, that you can keep some money and then buy in the event of shortages. So that in a sense also increased dependence, and we're told to focus on products that we have comparative advantage, but not necessarily those which are for the home market to satisfy the domestic market. So the policy space has been shrinking, largely driven by the regional institution advising our states on what ought to be done and what not to do. Yeah. So if you look at the key, I'll summarize some of the key land problems that I see as a hindrance to the wider right transition and ultimately to the development of the continent. So there's an existing settler land inequality, which is found primarily in the South. Zimbabwe has partly addressed that through a wide-ranging land reform in the 2000s. But the challenges still persist in Namibia and South Africa, which are still to implement a radical redistribution to address the inequities which exist between the white settlers and the black populace. The majority of land, Namibia, more or less the same situation in Zimbabwe, roughly 50% of the land split between the majority indigenes and the white German settlers. South Africa has been worse, up to 80% of the agricultural land is in the hands of white settlers. So Kenya, Algeria, moving up the continent, also face similar trajectory of land inequalities. So we have a settler colonial land question, which still remain to be resolved in many jurisdictions. Over time, we've also witnessed the increasing land scarcity across many jurisdictions in the continent. If you look at the FAO data, the average farm sizes in Africa, average arable farm sizes have declined from the 1960s. The per capita arable land has declined from about 0.54 of a hectare to 0.22 of a hectare. So increasingly, due to population growth and demographic growth and so forth, there's also been a decline in the land accessed by different households. Then another process also driving these immediate inequalities relates to process of accumulation from above and from below. Some of them led by the states, promoting access to land to certain groups, traditional leaders, passing land to people, relatives, and so forth, at the expense of the wider population. Then from below, with the growing commercialization, we witness the successful, the rich, so-called big peasants, accumulating land, displacing the poorer in order to enhance their disposal, the land at their disposal, in order to meet the wider objectives of profit generation and accumulation. Then the third problem, which one could talk about, relates to the foreign ownership of land. Yeah, this has been growing, passing out of land, even well before the so-called scramble, which is traced to the mid 2000. There's been passing out of land in various jurisdictions to foreigners for mining concessions, agricultural concession in Senegal. There's a big issue around the ownership of land by the Lebanese and so forth. So foreign ownership has also been marginalizing the indigenous from accessing land. Yeah, and more recently, we all know of the scramble, how the rush of different actors wanting to benefit from so-called unused land in Africa for mining, for agriculture, to meet the needs of the centers and marginalizing the needs, the food needs of the whole markets. The fourth problem one could highlight relates to the outward focus on land use policies. Yeah? promoting exports, export-led growth in agriculture at the expense of prioritizing food production. So priority in a lot of countries is accorded to crops which are destined for different sectors around the globe. And the crops which are grown by peasants tend to be marginalized, the food crops that peasants grow. In my own country, Zimbabwe, most of the funding allocation, particularly from the private sector, is channeled towards tobacco and a few other export crops at the expense of food crops, which are essential for the sustenance of the majority of the population in our country. Then the fifth problem that I'd want to highlight relates to discriminatory customary tenure systems. Yeah. The majority of people who inhabit in the rural areas, commonly called customary areas, reside there at the permission of the state, not as a legal right. And the eminent domain of the state is a key threat to the security of tenure. The state is a major actor in displacements to pave way for different types of investments, be it in mining, through the use of its eminent domain as the ultimate order of the radical title in those spaces. So tenure reforms are also on the card. Lynn will talk more about this, gender inequalities and land access and tenure security. I will not belabor much. I trust that Lynn will address some of these issues related to the gender concerns within the agrarian sector. So, if you look at the crisis of social reproduction, if you look at food, I'll just cite some recent, from 3 years or so ago, the global report on food crisis. Out of 50 countries which were facing food crisis, 32 were in Africa. So that shows you the extent of the challenges to provide basic food to feed the population in the country. So Africa is stuck at the level of resolving the basic agrarian question of improving agricultural productivity. That is to be resolved. Productivity in Africa is one of the lowest across the different regions, let alone providing agriculture acting as a supplier of raw materials to the industry, with the growing industries. So we still remain faced with a huge challenge in that respect. So what have been some of the policy responses to try to address some of these issues that the continent faces within the agrarian sector? Yeah. So immediately what comes into mind, there's been the resuscitation of the large farms as the panacea of leading us out of this quagmire of food insecurity. There's been a huge drive, huge promotion of large-scale farming across, particularly in the non-settler zones, which didn't experience settler zones. A couple of months ago, we in Ghana, we visited a region called Asitshwari, the banana, producing how small-scale peasants have been displaced by banana production for export. And these tendencies are ingrained in a lot of places, particularly in the former non-settler zones. Notwithstanding the ecological damage associated with the industrial culture that is gaining momentum to reverse the challenges, the productivity challenges which we face in the agriculture, in our agrarian sectors. Not to mention the exploitative labor relations which are associated with large-scale agriculture, which most of us in the southern parts are very familiar with the super exploitation of the workers who are integrated into those systems as wage laborers. So that has been one of the key responses. Alongside this, there's been a resurgence of contract farming to integrate small farmers as a solution to address challenges around agricultural financing through all sorts of schemes, or grower schemes and so forth, which are characterized by unequal relations between agribusiness capital and the peasantry. Yeah. So there's been an increasing focus to deepen the integration of the peasantry into the world markets through these different types of schemes. On top of that, you add the philanthropic schemes which are also promoting the penetration of capital. One which quickly comes to mind is the AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. They've recently changed their name, promoted by Bill Gates to promote the proliferation, the utilization of different types of inputs which are controlled by monopolies, hybrid, and different types of GM technologies to address the so-called productivity gap, but at the expense of the autonomy of the small scale producers. Yeah, and the responses to these policy initiatives have been disparate, and most of them activism linked to donor support and so forth. So there are radical responses to the ongoing policy responses. You want me to wind up?
You see, I offered him 30 minutes. He protested that I gave him too much.
Am I over 10 minutes already? Okay, so the radical responses are also few and limited, although there are some shows of promises that the renewed alienation of land from the peasantry in Africa could be challenged through social movements and so forth. The food sovereignty movement, which are growing particularly in West Africa, still on a smaller scale in these parts of the South. Yeah. So outside of the radical redistribution in Zimbabwe, challenging the dominant paradigm promoted by the Brilliant institutions are few and far between. Malawi and Zambia, to some extent, tried to promote a state, an expansive state-led subsidy, but still dependent on the supply of inputs by monopoly capital. So in the end, most of the surplus value ships back to capital. Even at this present juncture, the input scheme that is being run by the state here, most of the surplus value is shipping back to monopoly capital. If there's a scale down, the companies sneeze. Yeah, it reflects on the financial statements. If the input subsidy programs are scaled down, then it reflects on the financial statements of the different leading agribusiness companies which are supplying inputs towards the state-led input subsidy program. So briefly, what can be done? Land reform we need a genuine land reform. Land reform still remains a core component of that, although not sufficient for food security national development, just to be connected to a wider program of economic transformation. The agrarian reforms should reorient purpose, should include the reorientation of the purpose of and effectiveness of land utilization to satisfy the home market rather than an emphasis towards foreign currency generation all located within a wider national development strategy. So the issue of food security cannot be overemphasized. Food security and the high unemployment which characterize most of our region should be a major goal of such an agrarian reform. Equitable redistribution of land and secure land, not necessarily as private property, is a precondition for the social reproduction of an actually existing and growing peasantry in sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of studies are showing the growth in the number of farm households, particularly also after the COVID-19 wave, which displaced some people from the informal labor markets. And some of those jobs have not come back up to date. And land, as we know, is a fallback position for the majority of the people. So we need to redirect production towards satisfying food needs, internal markets, the country, to satisfy the domestic requirements for food and raw materials for industry, rather than emphasis towards satisfying the needs of the center. Gender equity, Liam will address this, will probably will address this in intervention. So how do we deal with the monopoly power? Revisiting the idea of cooperatives is Moyo, Jai, and recently reminded us, remains an important transcend the economies of scale that peasants faced when relating to the different monopolies and different initiatives. Yeah. So overall, the rebuilding of the productive forces of the small-scale farmers of the peasantry cannot be more than agent in this particular juncture for us to move ahead and improve the livelihoods of the different people, the majority of the people who inhabit the countryside. Thank you, Chair. Sorry for running the.
He has generously donated 2 minutes of my initial generous 30 minutes. Lynn, you have to go.
Not more than 15 minutes. Thank you, Chair. First, I guess this is an aside. I think we're too far into our collective thinking around gender and feminist questions to still be leaving these issues to a small handful of feminist scholars. And this is not a challenge on me to comment on. But that said, what I'm going to attempt to do is link contemporary development challenges in Africa to the problem of gender gleaning. And first, some broad questions around this. One is, how do we think of these questions of development from the margins, where our development trajectories are still very affected by the colonial structure, so what Walter was talking about earlier. 2 is, how do we think of development when the existing social conditions under which most of the world are making a living are marked still by chronic underdevelopment? And 3, how do we think of the right, I say this in quotes, the right to development in contexts that are marked by economic scarcity? So in this political question of rights, which is very much, the rights discourse very much frames the development discourse in Africa and the global South. So how do we think of this question of rights when the state that should be guaranteeing, which should be acting as the guarantor of rights, is also very much committed to mediating capital? So the nature of gender inequalities under this current mode of financialized capitalist development is such that capital and the state has now almost entirely externalized social reproduction to the peripheries. And the resulting situation is that the survival of working people increasingly depends on the extent to which this burden of social reproduction can be borne by households and the gendered labor between them. I think it's important to make the distinction. And again, of course, I'm referring to work that is performed majorly, but not exclusively by women. And this, of course, this externalization is taking place in the midst of ongoing enclosures of land, enclosures of labor, crippling debt that is either being shifted onto households, and also in the midst of a problem that I believe is one of the most pressing ones of our time. All this have been expressed in different ways in the last 2 days. The problem of the growing mass of surplus populations of the global south and the question of their sustenance. So in relation to this problem of social reproduction, the significance of a gendered substratum, if you think of a layer, a gendered substratum that is driving the core periphery imperialist relations of accumulation. This is generally acknowledged. It's not up for debate, actually. But I think it's important to understand that there is both a political as well as a social dimension that structures this relation, this core periphery relation and social reproduction, or the gendered substratum between it. And the main point I'm making here is that these gender inequalities constitute a central contradiction to development. This is a fairly straightforward point, but also that these contradictions are historically generated through the modes of social control, the modes of governance, the modes of political stabilization that are affected or were affected under colonialism, and therefore that constitute a structure that must be addressed as a condition for post-colonial development. So in essence, attention to these gender inequalities force us to pose in new ways the question of liberation. This has been part of our debates here in the summer school in the Agrarian South Network. But it is also impossible to talk about development. It's impossible to talk about development without addressing completely the question of liberation, not just of people, but of resources, of the institutions. But also not possible to talk about development without attention to the question of national sovereignty, precisely because of capital's continued reliance on the exploitation and expropriation of land and labor. And here I'm referring both to the traditional laboring classes and to reproductive labor. The major shift we are witnessing in this present neoliberal phase is that every productive activity is now a mere act of survival for most of the third world. In a sense, because it is disarticulated from accumulation or the possibility of accumulation, and therefore assumes much less importance to both national and global concerns. And here, of course, is the political question of our struggles. How do we articulate a development that is encompassing of the majority when these questions are just much less significant, both at national and globally, at national level and globally. If it's not aiding accumulation, it is easy to marginalize it. So in a sense, therefore, an exclusive focus or a predominant focus on exploitation, this is a critique of the ways in which these questions of gendered labor and social reproduction have been expressed even in the feminist literature, which is really around, trying to show relationships of exploitation and surplus value extraction. But I think because of this, because of what we're seeing in this late capitalist phase and this diminished attention, this survival question and diminished significance of these questions to the at national and global levels, a focus on exploitation surplus value kind of is increasingly an abstraction in the third world. And more relevant is the political question of survival, not just of labor, but of human life under different phases of capitalism, including in relation to climate change. And while the diminished contribution of agriculture to GDP in most developing countries of the global south is noted, I think in a similar way, these productivist arguments linking agriculture to capitalist development remains too limited, and industrialization remains too limited for understanding the development challenges facing the third world. So by disarticulating the economic question from the social and political questions raised by the enduring demand for land, there is an enduring demand for land. Even though there's a diminishing contribution of agriculture, land remains very central to not just our survival, but I think, when we listen to many of the political articulations from the margins, the feminist margins, the peasantry, and so on, it's articulating this question. So these productivist arguments ultimately fail to grasp the reproductive significance and the political significance of land. And the relationship to this that links land to social reproduction is structured around the regime of gendered labor. So the major point I'm making here is this, that in the still largely agrarian societies of the global south, land and agrarian reforms do not become irrelevant, as land still constitutes the basis of survival of millions of households. Walter was making this point. The other point of emphasis here is that in the agrarian south, the liberation question of gender has both political and social expression. Political to the extent that the demand for land, the demand for nature, and the commons as the basis of social reproduction, or one of the bases, reconstitutes the peasantry in general and the gendered laborers within it as legitimate subjects of the state. And here I'm talking about the very possibility of our struggles and the kinds of demands that we can make on the state. I don't want to do away with the state. I think we have to engage the state seriously, but we always have to ask, what are the ways in which we become legible to the state? In many ways, when we think of this surplus population, they're no longer even considered as legitimate subjects of the state. So there's a political question here, this liberation question linked to gender. And so that's the political dimension. It is social to the extent that this is a social dimension, or one of them. But in my thinking, it is social to the extent that the ensuing class struggle has to account for all the social dimensions that exist and which are expressed among the peasantry itself. The contradictions internal to the peasantry itself, which beyond class demand complete attention to the ethnic, to the caste, to the racial constitution, and so on, of the agrarian classes. We have to pay attention to these questions. A third point is that the progression of development on the basis of the gendered exploitation of labor and the sort of environmental destruction in the global south have been accelerated under the current model of industrialization. And so in an obvious way, these societies cannot actually be expected to develop under the same conditions of dispossession that pertained under colonialism. This is a point that Samir Amin makes. What are the conditions? When we're thinking of development, it's very, very clear that our starting points are different. There is no land for us to exploit. There is labor to exploit, but Utsa Patnaik talks about it too. We simply have nowhere to go. There's just not, we can't seek development under the same conditions of dispossession, because then we are not actually developing. So we must take this structural history seriously. And, this is the point of many third world intellectuals. Rodney, for instance, was critical of the tendency among bourgeois scholars to concentrate attention narrowly on economic development. And his point that this narrow focus reduces development simply to a matter of the combination of given factors of production, namely land, population, capital, technology, specialization, large-scale production. I want to quote Rodney here. Says, no mention is made of the exploitation of the majority which underlay all development. No mention is made of the social relations of production or of the classes. No mention is made of the way that the factors and relations of production combine to form a distinctive system or mode of production, varying from one historical epoch to another. And no mention is made of imperialism as a logical phase of capitalism. There have been debates and thinking in the feminist agrarian literature whether we can think of this gendered labor question, this substratum, as a specific mode of production. I mean, we have to think of these things, even if we don't arrive at that as a logical conclusion. So rather, Rodney is insistent that a serious engagement with the social relations of production and reproduction must inform our analysis. To him, the imperative for scholars of development is at least, this is quoting him again, at least to recognize the full human, historical, and social dimensions of development before it is even feasible to consider underdevelopment or the strategies for escaping from underdevelopment. And I think the gendered labor questions that I'm highlighting lend themselves in a concrete way to the possibility of interrogating these human, historical, and social dimensions of development that concern Rodney. I think a structural lens also compels us to grapple with the agrarian changes and ecological losses that accompany primitive accumulation, which have the effect of subsuming subsistence economies under the wage economy and petty trade, and through a gradual process of enclosure, separate the peasantry from land, creates a reserve army, and establishes a gender division of labor over domains that before this were not conformed a gendered structure. So again, talking about the historical significance of this, what we are sitting with now. So I want to end with the idea of development as rebellion. Mwalimu Shivji is not here, but this is borrowed from their recent, quite remarkable three-part biography, the volume on Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, which is authored by Mwalimu Shivji, our comrade Kamata, and Yahya Othman. The title of that volume is Development as Rebellion, biography of Julius Nyerere. But as I understand it, and maybe if Isa was here, he would correct me. I hope I'm not representing what is at the core, but I understand it. The idea, I understand from that book, and particularly from volume 1, which is authored by Issa, the idea of development as rebellion is an expression of the dialectical relationship between the needs of society on the one hand and the contestation of ideas, approaches, and resources on the other. That this is a place of profound contestation, in a sense, where the needs are not easily prescribed, but they have to be subjected to, the kinds of ideas that emerging, the approaches, and the resources. And this idea is not new. This is the idea of Fanon, of Cabral, who also elaborated in their own pieces on development, that true liberation of colonized society is possible only through constant examination and redefinition of the social and political imperatives of those societies, which in turn must emanate, or which necessarily must emanate from struggles informed by the actually existing material realities and social relations that appertain to societies. And these different formulations reflect a proper commitment to historicizing different societies. And I think we are largely in a peaceful debate, subjecting their development paths to their own unique historical experiences, specific insights, and political possibilities as the condition of development. And such historicization, in my view, offers the possibility through which to assess the significance of that gendered substratum that I was talking about earlier, a substratum that is central to both production and social reproduction. So to assess it against the various transitions and developments that are taking place in society. In other words, any attempt to stabilize the notion of gendered labor around a given set of ideas of what development looks like is bound to fail. It's not very useful because there is a huge, this is just one example, there is a huge surplus population that is actually in the third world determining the material needs of the majority. And at the same time, the development machine is completely oblivious to this surplus population. I mean, look at the current of reaction with right-wing populism among actually the most dispossessed stratums of society. Look at the amount of young people that are lending themselves to war efforts and so on. In a sense, I'm saying we can't, there's so much that is changing that is very difficult to determine what we need at any particular time, but we have to, I think, keep on paying attention to, what is needed at this time of implosions. So in the current trajectory of development, attention to the gendered division of labor and to gendered labor itself therefore appears both as critique of the political economy of development and also as methodology for reconstituting society along more just social relations and approaches to development. And all this is to say that the necessity or the fact of gendered labor is always a critique of the discourse of development in the third world, precisely because in its various articulations, you can't think of gender alone. It's not possible to think of gender in an anti-colonial sense on its own. It is always articulated to race. It's always articulated to class and to ethnicity and to caste, right? So this, I talk of gendered labor as critique of development because in its various articulations, class, caste, race, and so on, gendered labor or attention to gendered labor also raises the possibility of dealing with these other contradictions and the possibility of expressing our struggles from below in a more robust way. There's no analysis that will get us out of this quagmire that is just a gender analysis. We have to force ourselves and we have to articulate, whatever is you choose as your battle, we have to think of them together. So for instance, and this is just an example of this point, when we talk of the care economy, there's when you look at the mainstream economy literature on the care economy, which is, we are all talking about it, especially after the pandemic. It brought it legitimately back as something we have to be concerned about. But when we talk about the care economy in the global south, we are not talking about a positive process. We are never talking about a positive process. We are not at all in any way seeking accommodation within capitalism in the sort of social democratic sense. Our theorizations of care and social reproduction are in a sense fundamentally signaling a failure of development, right? Just the way social reproduction was always fundamentally a critique of capitalism, where you're talking of care economy, the need for it, the fact that it still remains a need. So all these things about how can we make care economies more equal is almost a contradiction of sorts, right? So our theorizations are fundamentally signaling a failure of development, but are also driven very deeply by an ethic of liberation. And this liberation is not just of women, as the majority of gendered laborers, but also of society as a whole. If we take these articulations of gendered labor seriously.
So, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Lynn and Walter. I will try to add on dialogue with what you presented. This conversation has been going on for so many years, and it shows up in the way we address issues. This is really an Agrarian South forum whose agenda has developed collectively over so long. I will please, Freedom, can you just project? I will use some visual help. Now I will do a bit of what I did the other day, going back to the social formation, and pull up some data from the ILO on Africa, specifically in its regions. This was published in the beginning of the year, last year, in a special issue dedicated to Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik in the Indian Journal of Economics, the India Economics Journal. It is a research that has combined within the network many influences that go back a long time. Of course, the Samoil influence, but apart from the collective influence, Praveen's work has been on labor, has been really what tilted me very strongly over the last 5 years in the analysis of labor relations more systematically and more empirically. Yeah. So this, thank you, Praveen. This has been, we published quite a bit together on labor, and the first paper that came out was again for a book for Prabhat's book, which came out after he retired.
Edited by
Jayanti, yes, and Chandru, and that's the first time where Praveen pushed us, Sam and myself, to think of this in a more global way, in a more systematic way. So this is a confluence of influences. Now, please, the first now any data doesn't speak exactly for itself, although it helps us visualize and think about how things are moving. But I will start with how it was, what the late colonial social formation, and how it has evolved. I think I will try to do this in 20 minutes. Is that okay? You're changing that? Okay. So if we look back at the thought, the political thought of the 1960s, the time in the 50s, the time when the national liberation movements were advancing, constituting themselves, entering into direct confrontation with the colonial state. The thinkers of the time were very much concerned with the class structure of African societies and with the political question of which class or which segment of this social formation had the potential to provide leadership for the national revolution. Now, they were very much concerned with that. So if we look at their writings, and they didn't have data like we do today, but they had lived practice, and their formulations arose from that. So if we compare Fanon, Cabral, Nkrumah's class struggles in Africa, they all very much, even if there were disagreements on these political issues and so forth, they all came up with a schema, which was five classes and segments. So there was the four monopolies at the top, then there were the petty bourgeoisies, a small segment, just below the four monopolies. Then there was a small proletariat, basically in the services, rail, ports, that type of logistics, but also domestic services and so forth. It was a small proletariat. The big portion of the population was a peasantry. Yeah, this today in the lingo of the ILO, the way it's presented, we could probably appear as a own account labor. Yeah, even though it was much more rural at that time, and today this category is much more mixed. There was a proletariat. Now this is all very, very schematic. Yeah, I mean, it's speculative because the numbers. Yeah, there's no way we can get it right. But also there's something that was not theorized, and it was the unpaid reproductive labor, which also was at the bottom of the pyramid, supporting the whole structure. This also, I have no real clue as to what the dimension would be, but let's just put it there just to heuristically. There was also a gender division. This is also hard to gauge, but the more closer you get to the top, the less women there will be, and the closer you get to the bottom of the pyramid, the more women. So that's basically the idea of this schema. There's nothing, don't take it, it's not the scale, it's just it emerged nonetheless from political practice. This phase is what with Sam, in fact, we wrote a lot about semi-proletarianization. So this was the initial phase. This is when these categories began to be blurred. The peasantry started entering the logic of urban migration and so forth. So there was an incipient differentiation, but it was very porous. These dotted lines here means that there were households that were straddling all of this. Yeah, so this was what I would refer to as the incipient phase of semi-proletarianization. Okay, now next slide. So jumping ahead to the late neocolonial phase, which is corresponds to the neoliberal period, we can see, and I will devote the rest of the talk to this, and I will come back to this new schema. How should we understand the social structure in this phase? So basically, in Africa in general, emerging all the regions, how has the intersectoral transition happened? So what we have is agriculture, industry, services. Agriculture in terms of working age, employed population, right? We're not talking about children. We're not talking about, it's not GDP, yeah? So it's just labor of the economically active population. So what we have is idle data. What is this, 49%? This was in, this is at the end of 2019. Yeah, 49% of the population, economically active population, including men and women, is 49% of it is occupied in agriculture. Yeah, 13 in industry and 38% in services. If we separate out women, 51% are in agriculture, so a higher figure. A lesser, much lesser, less than half of the figure in industry, industrial labor, and 41% a higher figure in services. Okay, so that's the first take. Yeah, these are the absolute numbers. Yeah, and these, yeah, if nothing happens, if history moves the same way, so this is going to keep going like that. Yeah. Next, oh, let's go. Can you next slide, please? As far as the intersectoral, I get a snapshot of 92 and 2019. What we see if we compare this, this is agriculture, yeah, agriculture, and then 2019 of North Africa, Southern, West, Central, and East. These are the categories of the African Union, yeah, and also the ILO uses the same. So what we see is from this, for example, North Africa, there has been from almost 40% of the working age population involved in agriculture. 30 years later, it's down to maybe 25%. It's a radical drop. In 30 years, these are very dramatic. I don't think there's any comparison in recent history. This for Southern Africa, the drop is also there from 50 to 45. Now, West Africa, the drop is also from around 55 to 40. Now, this is Central Africa from 75 or so to 62 or so. In East Africa from 70 or so to 65 or so. So these are the drop from agriculture. The question then is, where does this get channeled? Yeah, in terms of intersectoral relations. So industry, it's all very small, and you have very little variation. Because it has not been absorbed in industry. Yeah, most of it has been absorbed in services and outside the and didn't appear in this graph, but outside the I don't know why it didn't appear in this graph, but anyway, outside the workforce as well. Okay, so that's basically the same tendencies that we saw the other day are for the South generally reappearing in Africa in this particular way. Now, these regions, apart from being the AU regions, if we recall Samir Amin, he had now these data need to be historically analyzed. Why is it that these tendencies are occurring in these regions, in these sub-regions this way? Samir Amin had his classic formulation of the three sub-regions, whereby there was a peasant economy linked to commerce, yeah, under monopolies in West Africa with some indigenous plantations and other mining and so forth. But that population remained as a peasant overall population with some labor migration to the coastline for the plantations. Southern Africa, did you already switch it? Oh, no, okay. No, wait. Southern Africa was of the labor reserves. That's where the great displacements took place. The land was taken. There was colonial settlement, private property in a bang. You know, it was a very dramatic transition in this region. Labor reserves were constructed. And this, as we will see, shows up in this data. North Africa also had a settler experience, mainly Nigeria, but also in the neighboring, in the Maghreb. East Africa, the Central Africa was of the concessions. Now this is where the big companies, rubber companies and so forth, and mines later would come in, gain concessions, gain control over the land, and just proceed in exploiting the resources in a very violent way. And this is where the biggest genocide happened in the late 19th century. And then East Africa also had similar experience, but the regions, the countries in the region were not actually displaced in the same way. They didn't have the same, to the same degree, the type of displacement that occurred in Southern Africa. So next slide, please. So of course, 50 years later, this situation has evolved. One of the questions, with Sam Moyle, he had already broached this question, beginning with the starting point of Samir Amin's regions. How, 50 years later, under neoliberalism, we're talking about from the 1960 until today, that's over 50 years. Where does this leave? Where does this leave the regions? What is a colonial mode of accumulation still relevant, or how has it changed? Just to throw out the argument, what I will try to show, and it was in the paper, it was discussed more fully, is that the labor reserves of the South now have been exported to the whole continent. That's the most dramatic change of the moment. Yeah, so the whole continent now is a labor reserve. It's not engineered in the way that the political engineering happened under apartheid. Now it's under a monopoly capitalism that has its own spontaneous type of forces. So now the whole continent is a labor reserve. Yeah? The concessionary economies of Central Africa have also been that model has been exported. Now oil and gas and all types of mining has under concessions has been exported everywhere, even to regions which do not have concessions of this sort. Yeah, the whole West Coast is under oil exploration, and if we just go further, we can see how this type of modernized concessions, it's not the same concession of the past. There's disputes over it, the contracts evolve and so forth. But that has also been generalized. Yeah, the peasant economies of the West show up in the figures also that they remain the most peasant economies of the region, and also East Africa. And Sam's point was that two things were happening under neoliberalism, on the agrarian question in particular, that there was due to the land grabs and so forth, which went through phases, large-scale property was appearing where it was not there before, outside the settler colonies. And also a trimodal structure was emerging, where you had a middle peasantry, which was linked into these global value systems and so forth, became linked to it. But it was externally oriented, and the poor peasantry. Yeah? So Sam's point was that Africa was changing in its agrarian structure, and this was also a generalized process. The emphasis was different due to historical reasons in every place, but it was a general process. Yeah, and even in the settler economies, there was a convergence with the rest of the continent by virtue of the re-peasantization of Zimbabwe. So one settler colony was undone in that sense. Yeah? So Sam began to speak of a structural convergence in the continent. He didn't take that too much further after. In fact, this discussion was cut short by his untimely demise. But I've tried in this paper to take forward some of these thoughts and operationalize them through this data. So the next slide, now the North Africa and Southern Africa have certain characteristics which are similar, and they correspond. I mean, the legacy of the colonial model accumulation does appear. Yeah. So you have a higher percentage, yeah, of proletarianization, yeah, and the middle categories get squeezed, and a high level of being thrown outside the market, the workforce. 57% for women. This goes up to 81%. Yeah, and the proletarian labor for women is 9%, whereas here it's 24%. So the gender cleavages are much more stark, as we see in the other regions, even though everywhere they are stark. But these numbers here, being the working age population thrown outside the workforce, are the worst on the continent, as we will see. And it's an indication of why the North African region is boiling
as it is. Huh? Of course, it doesn't reduce to one issue, but you cannot ignore the fact that the population is being completely thrown out of the workforce. Huh? Next slide, please. Southern Africa, same in terms of proletarianization. Now, the methodology is a regional methodology. It's not country-based, national methodology. That has its own virtues. But let's just work with this because there are also regional economies in terms of labor markets. They may not be regional in terms of, so regional in terms of trade integration or other types of integration, but in terms of the labor market, it is not wrong, it's not illegitimate to think regionally about these regions. So Southern Africa, of course, has its own history in the labor migration, very strong. So 24% after, actually it's gone down under neoliberalism from 26% at the beginning of the period. Proletarian labor reduced. This was the result of neoliberalism. The great capitalist experiment did not create more wage labor. 26% his own account. For women, it's 26% again. Proletarian labor for women is 18%, below that of men. You see, in comparison to North Africa, it's all more spread out. All segments have more space. And at the end, 34% outside the workforce for generally, and 38% for women. So that's the Southern Africa. Of course, South Africa is the greatest weight in this demographically in this schema. And you can find differences, of course, if you enter more to the national levels. Next slide, please. Now, West, Central, and East Africa also are somewhere. You see, proletarian labor in general, 10%. For women, 6%. Own account labor, the biggest, second to outside of workforce. So these are the peasant economy. This is West Africa. So somehow the legacy shows up in these figures. You have much larger own account labor, which is peasant and urban and so forth. But I think it's a lot, you have to explain these figures. Figures don't speak for themselves. How is it that these regions differ? They have a history. These are the stronger peasant societies where they were not dislocated from their early times as they were elsewhere. For women, own account is 32%. Proletarian labor is 6%. So we're in capitalism in this late phase of neocolonialism, and this final phase of imperialism has not created its quintessential labor relation in the peripheries. It has not created wage labor to sustain populations. It's created a different social formation. Next, please. Central, I think it's central. Again, a wider spread, 12% proletarian labor, 6% here for women, 39%, this is Central Africa, own account labor, 37 for women, outside the labor force, 33 and 38 for women. So it's similar to West Africa and East Africa, please. One more. So these regions are not too different. In the way it shows up in the statistics today, they're quite similar in their spreads. And it corresponds to some historical dynamics. We need to be able to explain these. So again, East Africa, 32% on account labor, 25 for women. Proletarian labor very low, 14 and 9, 28% outside the workforce and 35 here. Anyway, so I won't bore you with all the things. Let's one more. The next slide is a mistake. Please go switch it. It's a wrong slide. It doesn't. It's completely slipped in by mistake. I'll remove it later. But it's in the paper if you want the correct slide. No. Next. This is completely wrong. Next slide. Going downwards. Down. Going on. Okay, this is the last slide. So this is, if we go back to that rationale, if we go back to think about the class structure, what is the social pyramid today? It's much more, this is what I like to call the generalized stage of semi-proletarianization. So
what happens is it's much more segmented here, but it's also very porous, completely porous. The fact that a household can straddle all of this. Yeah, it's what Isa Shiji called the working people. Yeah, it's not the proletariat as it could be thought in a pure way. It's something else. It's the working people. It's popular social formation made up of working people which straddle all kinds of segments. Again, but it's the data of the ILO does not. It has its deficiencies. It's not a class analysis the way we would like it. When proletarian labor shows up, this is a very differentiated category. There's the high end of the proletarian labor, the skills, which you can find in finance, insurance, and education. But you can also find the poor proletarian labor, which is in poverty. Yeah. So this has to be in our scheme. Also, going back to class analysis, we have to now recreate a schema. Yeah, and this is what we have absorbed in our own accumulated knowledge. Yeah. So there's a skill. There's the monopolies at the top. A domestic bourgeoisie which exists. Yeah. The first land grabs, for example, we're not just on the agrarian question in the 1980s. Sam had shown, and in the 1990s was carried out not by foreigners but by a domestic bourgeoisie which got a hold of its means of production in the countryside of it. So there's other bourgeoisies also, but it's a small, in necessarily in all countries of the world, even in the North US, the bourgeoisie is a small part of the population. In the USA, strictly speaking, bourgeoisie is, I'm not talking about middle class, bourgeoisie, because the middle class, most of it is proletarian anyway, but the bourgeoisie, which it doesn't reach 6%. Yeah? So it's not like it's a big, but here it's, it's even, the data is like 1 or 2%. Yeah, the employing class in Africa, 1 or 2%. There's an unskilled proletariat. There's the own account labor. It's not to scale, so please don't. The contributing family labor, which shows up in the data, is lower. Those middle categories. The unemployed, rigorously defined in the way they do, is a very small part of the population. Outside the workforce, and then the unpaid labor, not to scale. Okay, but this is this generalized, and there's the gender cleavage also shows up. Could go more like that. But anyway, just to put it on the map that these are gendered, workforce. So that one of the factors. I will end with this, but this does bring up many questions. It could be perfected. It could be challenged. It could be, it's just a heuristic device. But I think it does generally reflect some of the general tendencies of the class structure of the social formation. The final question, I suppose, is comes up. The question of the state has come up. Is the question of politics. At the end of the day, we are also in a neoliberal political age, where it's highly NGOized, all the societies. There's all kinds of civil society organizations that have one focus, on which they dedicate themselves. Some may have a larger combination of both sides, like gender, women's movements may have various, or some the food sovereignty movement, they can have a bit of a bigger range of concerns, but they don't have not necessarily a national vision. It's very difficult to have a national vision. That requires, systematic articulation over time, which can only happen in political parties. So whatever social movements, civil society organizations, whatever the role they play, and among them, the good, the bad, and the ugly, at the end of the day, nothing happens, or nearly nothing happens, unless political parties with a radical orientation exercise hegemony over these social formations. When political parties don't do that, all kinds of things can happen anyway, this all time, but it shows up in the military uprisings in the Sahel,
this is also not only an African phenomenon. We were talking yesterday about the coups in the North African region in the Middle East. There was a provocative by Max, the provocative. I guess it might be right. I suppose I don't have enough knowledge to contest it, but the point was that there's generally the coups in the Arab world have always been aggressive somehow. But we also see in Latin America, Venezuela, Chavez. Yeah, so it's not only, and then in the case of Chavez, after they took power, then after that they realized they had to create a party. So the party is necessary, whatever you do. Yeah, and I think I don't know how it's going to evolve this in health, but even here in Zimbabwe, highly semi-proletarian population. How did the land reform happen? How did the mobilization happen at a national level? How did it happen in the rural countryside? How did it happen in the urban areas? All within a single framework of mobilization through a party. This is exactly the proof that political parties can mobilize are the only source, the only potential, in my view, of a large-scale mobilization. Otherwise, it becomes incoherent, it's rebellious, it's this and that. It subsides, it explodes. It's not. It's not without the party. It's difficult to move. So I will leave it there. I'm tempted to share my reflections from the conversation, but I think it's been quite a while, and I don't want to risk imposing my interpretation of what has been said on you. So we have, if I have an opportunity in the end, I will complement. In the meantime, please, we can still take another half an hour. Is that possible? It's 3:22 at the moment. So let's commit another half an hour to comment the discussion. For
coffee break.
Tea, coffee break.
We have to have a break and then next session.
There's another session coming.
Yes.
Well, that then gives us only 7 minutes.
15.
We started late. We started late. We started an hour late. So can we eat 15 minutes into the next one?
15, yeah. Try half an hour later.
We start at
Yes, half an hour. Yeah, half an hour.
Chair, you're too generous with your.
I am very generous.
You need
Yeah.
30 minutes.
That's all right. Chair would speak when I have some opportunity. So the floor is open. Some brief comments, some questions. Can somebody help with the mic? We can start with the end and then come round.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fadzai. Mine is a comment, sort of a question. I just wanted to ask that feminist scholars, they present gender inequalities as a very complex and political issue, and it seems almost hopeless to solve it. And having been a government worker myself, I can say with 100% confidence that on the ground, most of the mainstreaming efforts, they are not really transformative in terms of gender inequality, solving gender inequalities. So I just wanted to find out, besides the political parties, the more radical suggestion of the political parties starting some form of a movement, are there any other solutions to this important issue of gender inequality?
Can we just go around and, if you don't mind, take some notes and you know, next, this way.
Thank you much for this presentation. In fact, I'm going back to the precious numbers about the regions of Africa. In fact, Paris, you mentioned the revolts in North Africa. In fact, after these revolts, after these uprisings, the most serious and difficult question was which were the classes that led these revolts. And the response was not on a class basis in the beginning, but afterwards it evolved. But in the beginning, as history is written by the strongest, it is also written by the last standing person. And the last standing persons who were in the streets, at least in Tunisia, on the last day of the fall of the regime, were the professionals of liberal, not liberal in a political way, like liberal jobs, like doctors and lawyers. And that's the image we got just before the fall of the regime. But before it, which expanded in 1 month, in fact, it started with dispossessed peasants. And the first person to ignite this was a fruit vendor who used to be a peasant, and he got dispossessed by death. Secondly, the revolt propagated more, and it went to other interior regions, as we call them. These regions that are either highly rural or highly semi-proletarianized, and they were like the result of rural exodus. And going further in these mobilization, we go to the big cities, the coastal cities, the economically big cities in Tunisia. The peri-urban neighborhoods, they revolt first. So they are also semi-proletarianized, unemployed, etc., etc. These classes, until it reached its political momentum. This exact was the result of 2 waves of liberalization in Tunisia. The first one in the 1970s, which was liberalization, and in the 80s, neoliberalization. And both witnessed huge waves of rural exodus. It was direct. It was like in 1970, the wave was direct, and in 1986, it was direct. And this leads us to the last point about also the feminization of agricultural labor in North Africa and the Middle East, the MENA region. It's the highest in all in all regions of the world, like MENA, West Africa, South Africa, etc. According to FAO, I don't know if numbers are they precise or not, but it is the highest. Thank you.
Hi. I don't know if you have respond on this, but for example, in Argentina, we were discussing about a health and care system that implies that the state invests in a structure and employ people. So this kind of investment creates jobs and it has a lot of benefit for the society. But I think this can work in an urban area. So in society that has a lot of work in agriculture, I don't know how other proposal or how other politics could implement something similar to that.
Thank you for these excellent presentations. I have more of a provocation or a comment for Lynn, which is that the question or the emphasis on the struggle for survival rather than a struggle against exploitation had me thinking about contemporary parallels in the Arab region, where very much likewise, right, the face of the struggle is not a struggle against exploitation at all, right? It's a struggle likewise for survival against the political violence of imperialism or late neocolonialism as a global regime. I think it could be productive to be thinking about the similarities in terms of the struggle for survival, but also the contrasts, and that we can, it seems that especially in the labor reserves you're talking about, the forces attacking survival, are proceeding more through the dual compulsion of the economic process or through national forms of primitive accumulation, whereas in the Arab region, it's extra national and it's linked to the attack on the political sovereignty regime.
Go around that way because you completely wrong. Anyway, you check. Yeah. Those online, does anybody want to contribute, ask a question? There's nothing on the chat. There's nothing. Yeah, they can't hear me. No, there's no question. There's no questions. Jyoti wants to ask something.
Yes, thank you very much for three really engaging presentations. My question is actually for Paris. So I really found it helpful, the superimposition of ILO statistics on the discussion of political economy of class formations and so on. But I think the biggest challenge for me was the categories you deployed, which were a mix of ILO categories and Marxist categories. And that is a bit confusing because it does not allow us, when we are thinking about class relations, to think about the relationships among these classes in the way in which you have described it in the triangle. Same thing to do with gender relations, the issues that Lynn was raising about social reproduction and so on. It's almost as if maybe women do slightly more of it and men do some of it. Whereas in the literature, we get the impression that this is an area of struggle and antagonistic relations and so on. So I'm wondering, I think this is a very important exercise. It speaks to my feeling that perhaps we need different categories when thinking about labor relations in Africa. So how can we take forward this work? Thank you.
I have a question also. So I had the privilege of listening to Paris present some of this, but broader, the student class. And in that presentation, especially the sectoral shifts, he compared the regions, but also in the structure of the labor force. So it was clear the specificity, but also the shared trajectories following periods of liberalization, neoliberalism.
Bye. Safe travel.
So my question is this: what explains in the case of the labor shifts, the resilience of the excess labor, surplus labor, reserve labor faction, and what also explains the relative slow shift in the case of Africa in the change in sectoral composition work. Okay. Anybody of the three of you who might want to start, respond to the questions and comments. Two questions to you.
Don't know, that's right. Indeed, on these care jobs, think that's precisely the problem. Of course, they're resolving a certain problem of chronic unemployment, and they're bringing women into the labor force, but in highly unequal terms and so on. And I think part of the problem is that that care work, women doing it in more intense ways in the formal labor market does not release them from the historical burden. There's no decrease in the kind of care work they're already doing. But also for me, more importantly, is that it's not possible to think of care. There's no way to magically reimagine that care is something positive under capitalism, and it's not. So, we are being forced to kind of accept, okay, it's a very UN-driven, ILO-driven discourse, very NGO, that now how can we make caring economies caring? It is really an oxymoron, right? So I don't know. I think we can structure it without being too pessimistic. There are some benefits that can go to women. We can accord them certain things like, national health insurance, things that make life more livable. And I think it's possible to do those things. But I don't think we should surrender the reality that it is a critique, it's a problem. The fact that this economy just keeps growing, it tells us we are moving further away from where we should be going closer. And Mark said, yeah, I totally agree. This is a debate. It's interesting, and I don't think, I've not, this is probably the first I'm hearing about these politics as a reaction to the attack on political sovereignty. And of course, the big question is, what is the nature of the demand that is being placed, whether it is on the state or on this gendered substratum? What should we be looking at? If it's not a purely economic question, if it's extra national, what does it mean for our politics? Yeah.
Thank you. And I didn't receive get any specific comment. Maybe the issues, the discussion I want to pursue relates to the new social formation that you. So one of the things that I was wondering, if we were to make income data on these classes, how it will all turn out. Some studies which I've seen recently are showing disengagement from non-farm activities, increasing concentration within agriculture itself, rather than a movement away from agriculture towards services. And this is a study over 6 countries, which account for about 52% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa. So perhaps income data will also help us to take the arguments forward on how we met this new social formation that is emerging on the continent. Yeah, that's my point. This is a
Okay. The first question, the data will not show you any struggle. It's we who see struggle in the data. Yeah. So it will not. It doesn't speak for itself. The ILO data has evolved the way it has. It has simplified it down to all these few categories. But the problem is that these categories, within them, the categories have differences. So on account labor, is it your classic petty bourgeoisie? But we know that the small enterprises, you can have those at the top who are doing okay. They have a higher number of employees. They reproduce themselves at a not great accumulation, but they're there over time,
and then those who are hardly surviving. Yeah, so that category is an ILO category. Yeah, the working class also, the liberal professions. Yeah, lawyers, teachers, insurance. These are skilled professionals, but they also have those who hardly survive on a wage. Yeah? So this data does not. It's Walter's intervention that can help us a bit more, because the wage can also indicate the wage level, can indicate a bit more, enrich, or even change some of these schemas. And as far as the classes, I think that there's basically two classes, and within them, even in the bourgeoisie, there's fractions. Within the working class, there's segments. So these are all the segments of the working class, the working people. So that is the real task for analysis. I think it just needs to go forward and taken forward in whichever way. As far as Charles's intervention question, the resilience. Yeah, what resilience means, I'm not sure, because people are dying. It's like there is genocide on the horizon. Yeah, it's already happening in Palestine. Violence is escalating. So it's in terms of there's resilience, but also a lot of destruction, waste, as among the surplus population, as Ali Qadri has put it. But in terms of political resilience, that's the question, because I think if I just reformulate the question, what I have also argued, that this type of social formation, which is also found in the other regions, has insurrectional pressures built into it. Explosive rebellions that are mostly unorganized, without one force exercising hegemony over them. They explode and they recede. Now, we see this in Latin America, we see this in Africa. I can name all, but even the Arab Spring was a type of explosive uprising that spread across the region. Yeah? But in South Africa in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, that was riots, exploded, receded. Yeah? Nigeria, against the police 2 years ago, against the start, whatever it was called, in names, but it exploded. Sorry. Yeah. But if in Latin America, geez, if you just look at the whole of Latin America, it's into the last 20 years, it's just been in a insurrectional situation. So this has to be explained somehow. I'm not sure that if we can find this type of characteristic in the previous social formation, but in the same way, that the rebellion in the late colonial social formation congealed around a national movement, which had a purpose, which was to take power and put an end to rule. Now, this one has. I've tried to develop this a bit further, but I think there's something there that needs to be noted. Now, as far as the other question about the slow intersectoral change, Arrighi had written in 2002 or so. He had returned to the study of Africa after few decades. He had written a piece called "The African Crisis: Regional and Systemic Comparisons." Yeah, and his object was to compare East Asia, not China in that case, in that time, because the tigers, with Africa, which both of which entered into some kind of transition in the 70s. And his task was to explain why the foreign direct investment, industrial type, not the foreign direct, which is land grab and so forth, but the industrial type of foreign direct investment went to East Asia and not to Africa, because Africa was promised. If you liberalize it, if you open everything up, the money, the investments will come. And they never came. And they went there. So he had this paper but the paper was flawed in so many ways. He explained Africa by what it lacked in relation to East Asia and not what it had. Yeah. So his conclusions were that, so I can't remember the whole thing, but one conclusion was that there wasn't a workforce easily available. It hasn't been proletarianized yet. Whereas this was easily, it was already existing in East Asia, and it could be, capital could exploit it. But these figures, gosh, they show us that proletarianization has just exploded. Or just a real exodus, an exodus which doesn't lead to a fully proletarianized workforce. So that argument lacked, in the least, it lacked statistics behind it. The other argument was that there was no national bourgeoisie capable of absorbing and handling the foreign investments and channeling them into productive investment. So there was no partner. But again, the state itself, historically, when a bourgeoisie doesn't exist, the state can fulfill the functions. Yeah. So again, we can discuss why the states were not able to handle these functions. That's a different argument. So anyway, I won't go into. But the fact is that Africa was left out. But most of the regions deindustrialized. Not only Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and the others that were more industrialized than others. But in Latin America as well, the data showed the other day was industrial labor has actually declined in this period. And so most of these regions went through what Africa has gone through. They've lost their intersectoral relations went worse. They had better intersectoral relations, so they went worse. The foreign investments went mostly to the east, to China. And China, I was able to had a well-educated and healthy workforce. A system of scientific production that could engage in its own way, state companies that would enter into their own agreements with foreign capital. So all these are elements that need to be taken into consideration. Yeah? And it's in fact a state that was very propulsive state with a planning system, an ideology. So these are some of the things that would have to come into our analysis, because these. In fact, Latin America has been also deprived this type of transition.
Thank you very much. Round of applause for three excellent presentations. And it turns out that the chair's time allocation wasn't too bad at all. So have a great break and see you back.